Okay, today we're going to be talking about constitutions, specifically the Texas Constitution. What's really important to understand about a constitution is it's generally an agreement between the state itself and the people who are being governed within that state. Now, there's all sorts of different kinds of constitutions and different kinds of countries and municipalities that exist underneath constitutions. And what's mostly important is whether or not the country or your area or your state or whatever actually follows that constitution. Because there's a lot of organizations out there or countries out there that have a constitution, but don't actually follow it. Meaning whenever the leader of that particular location decides he or she doesn't like the agreements that were put forth in the Constitution, basically just doesn't do anything that he or she is supposed to actually do. So usually what they'll do is they'll get the other parts of the balance of power to give them a little more power than they're supposed to have, which usually breaks the very basic idea of what the Constitution stands for. And this happens quite often and is a big problem. Well, Texas falls under the Texas Constitution, which for its supremacy actually falls under the US Constitution. And fortunately, we're one of those areas that actually follows its Constitution. So at any one time, you're not going to have, leaders deciding that the Constitution is no longer giving them what they want, so they decide not to follow it anymore. Well, Texas, they don't do that. They follow the Constitution, and there's all sorts of legal ramifications if they don't. And so they do pretty much everything they can to avoid those, because those can be pretty dire and pretty bad situations. So let's talk about the importance of the Texas Constitution. And we'll talk a little bit about the history and kind of the elements thereof of what consists within our Constitution itself. The first thing to understand before we get into the actual Texas Constitution is that we do fall under the US Constitution. And there's a thing called the Supremacy Clause, which means basically that when we're dealing with final decisions, like if our state constitution says we're allowed to do something, but our federal constitution says, actually, you're not allowed to do that thing. Well, because of the Supremacy Clause, which is part of the US Constitution, that means it takes precedence over anything in a state constitution. So all of the states, all 50 states, they can pretty much write whatever they want to write, as in, we believe we have all of these rights. But if it goes against what the federal constitution says, then it doesn't count. If that makes sense. So when we're talking about division of power between the states and the federal government always does have the final say. But it's also important to understand that the way that the federal constitution was actually created is if it doesn't actually indicate that something has to be done because of a certain thing that's written into the federal constitution, then the states do have the final say-so on something that's not covered by the federal constitution. So that's kind of how the Supremacy Clause works. So if we didn't cover it, then you're pretty much, capable of doing whatever you want to do. And so there's all sorts of nuances that cause all sorts of problems that gets decided in the state courts, because the state courts look and say, are we actually following the rules that we're supposed to be following? And if they think they have, it can then get appealed to the federal courts, and the federal courts will then look at it and say, are you, breaking any of the constitutional rights of the people that are guaranteed under the federal constitution, or the rights of the country itself against the rights that were actually put forth in the federal constitution. My throat's kind of going bad, so I'm taking a drink here. Okay, so let's talk about some of the principles that are really important under the pretty much all constitutions, but specifically we're going to be talking about the state constitution of Texas. So some of the principles that we want to definitely follow, the first one being popular sovereignty, which basically means that the power of the Constitution itself resides with the people. So going back way back in time, back to Hobbes and to Locke and Rousseau, basically the basis of the social contract theories, the idea was that the people gave the power to the government, and they gave the power to the government in order to protect the people, not just because certain people should have power, but because we need to be protected, these people need to actually have the power to do that sort of thing. And so, like I said, the first principle was popular sovereignty, which means the people gave us that right. And the second principle is kind of tied to that, which is the social contract theory, which is that all individuals possess inalienable rights. I always have trouble saying that word, and willingly submit to the government to protect those rights. The third principle is separation of powers. Now, you may know that as like checks and balances. So if there's a challenge to a particular law, we have the court system to respond to it, to say that shouldn't be a law, or it was a law, or it was correct. The legislature makes the laws, and then you have your executive, who's basically your governor and attorney general and all of that, all of those people who actually enforce the laws. And so they do that through the police services that we have that represent the state. And so those are basically the three principles. Now, let's talk a little more about the history of kind of what brought Texas to have its constitution. I mean, it didn't just kind of come out of nowhere. And so our first constitution in Texas, if you read through the book, it talks about the Republic of Mexico. And so the first laws that we actually had that were kind of like on the books, if you want to call it that, being a constitution, came from the Republic of Mexico. And so a lot of the rules that were kind of put in place, well, part of the problem is I've mentioned before in the previous lecture that Texas is a very individualistic type of state, and the people are very individualistic and kind of like, go their own way and kind of the way they want things done. And so the things they didn't like about the Republic of Mexico's constitution, they basically didn't follow. And so all sorts of problems came, and that actually basically led to the revolution and kind of like what kind of threw out Mexico as the government, which then leads us to the Republic of Texas Constitution, which is from 1836. And this is kind of like our first formation of actual government before we became part of the United States. And then in 1845 is the statehood constitution, which is the next variation of the constitutions that they create. And then we have the Civil War. And so, one second. It's always bad to try to record these things when your throat starts to go bad. Okay, so the Civil War, our first constitution that we actually follow is under 1861, which is basically the Confederacy. And so that kind of like gives the standard of where the state of Texas is supposed to be going forward. Well, after the Civil War ends and basically slavery was abolished, that's in 1866, they changed the Constitution again, to incorporate those changes. And then a couple of years later, 3 years, as a matter of fact, in 1869, we have what's called Reconstruction, which is where the North, which won the war, comes into the South and pretty much sets up their own governors and their own control, kind of like trying to get the state back into the republic again. But in order to do that, you have to follow certain rules in order to, make the cut, in order to be the state that we want to be. And so there's a lot of freedoms that are kind of curtailed, at least until they can, get things back under control. And so basically what they do is in 1876, they finally adopt the Constitution of the state of Texas. And this is the one we're actually following today. And so this is this is the one that kind of like incorporates everything and leads to the idea that we have amendments and all these kinds of things that we can add to it. So the first thing we do is we add a bunch of different amendments. Before we talk about the amendments themselves, let's talk about the main articles of the Texas Constitution. So the Texas Constitution of 1876, Article 1 is basically their Bill of Rights. Whereas in the federal Constitution, the Bill of Rights are the amendments that kind of come after it. The articles themselves actually incorporate the Bill of Rights, that all the guarantees of the people who live within the state of Texas. Article 2 is the separation of powers, which I've mentioned before, which is the executive, legislative, and the judicial. So basically, you have, your leader, who's your governor, who actually incorporates or encompasses the federal within the state power. Then you have your executive, which is, what's your executive? Your legislative, I'm sorry, which is your actual people who actually make the laws. So we separate our house into two different houses. So we have both a kind of like our federal system, where we have a House of Representatives and a Senate. Well, we have a House for the state and a state legislature. So they kind of, so what we have is we have the House and basically a Senate within the state itself. So it kind of looks a lot like the federal, and it kind of does the same things where it's different areas are represented by different people. Because remember, this is a republic we're actually talking about. So that's the separation of powers. Article 3 is the legislative branch. So they start talking about the specific separation of powers by the different articles. So Article 3 is the legislative branch, which is the Senate and the House. Article 4 is the executive department, which we've talked about, like is the governor, the lieutenant governor, your AG, your attorney general. And basically all of that encompasses your kind of like your people who are literally in charge of the government, as in the individuals themselves. And then you have a judicial department, which is the judges, people who kind of like kind of serve as a check on the legislative and the executive kind of going forward. We do have amendments, quite a few amendments actually in the state constitution, whereas there's only like 20 something amendments in the federal constitution. There are a lot of amendments in the state constitution. An interesting thing about that is when you read the book, it's going to tell you that there's been 677 amendments that were proposed, and then 498 that were actually approved. Well, since the writing of the book, so as of 2022, we actually have 690 amendments now, excuse me, and actually 507 that were actually approved. So we approve a lot, practically every year. So kind of keep that in mind. Our document is like an ever-changing document, so it's kind of constantly evolving based on how the people of that particular time feel. So if the leaders decide to incorporate more laws or more rules into their constitution, they tend to do it, and they do add quite a few of them. So that's like literally 13 since the book has actually been written that got added or that got proposed. So that's quite a few. As a matter of fact, all of the ones that were proposed actually became rules. So a lot of them that kind of happened. So one of the important things to remember is that our Constitution is an evolving document. So the Constitution that we have today will not necessarily be the exact Constitution that we have tomorrow. But at the same time, some of the same principles will always remain within there, such as we're always going to have popular sovereignty, social contract theory, separation of powers. Those things stay within it. and it all of the other things that kind of get changed based on the mood and the needs of the people of that particular day. So that's the idea of what we're talking about for a constitution, and that's where I'm going to kind of leave it from here. The book covers quite a bit more, so definitely read through that. It has a lot with the history, so follow through that and kind of understand where we are. The PowerPoints definitely follow along with the book and give a lot more detailed information. I'm giving you more kind of a background kind of to where things are going, and hopefully that'll get you to where you need to go so we can continue on with this class.